The man from the bank smiled. It was the kind of smile that wasn't for the person in front of him, but for the policy behind him. A shield made of politeness. He slid a single sheet of paper across the polished cherry desk. The paper had the bank's logo at the top and several paragraphs of small, dense type. An account disclosure summary. He tapped a highlighted line with a manicured finger. The line mentioned the monthly service fee for dormant accounts with a balance under $100, a standard practice. He spoke in a calm, practiced tone, the one reserved for difficult but necessary conversations. The fee, he explained, was $35. The account balance, before the fee, had been $12. The new balance was negative $23. He was sorry for any inconvenience. The older man sitting opposite him did not look at the paper. His name was Arthur Vance. He wore a flannel shirt, clean but faded at the elbows, and denim trousers that bore the faint, dusty outline of a wallet in the back pocket. His hands, resting on his knees, were thick with the memory of work, knuckles like knots in old rope. He looked past the smiling manager through the glass wall of the office to the lobby beyond. People stood in line. A mother distracted a small child. The digital sign on the wall flashed interest rates for auto loans and home mortgages. The world hummed along, oblivious. Arthur brought his gaze back to the man behind the desk. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and took out a small, worn passbook. It was dark blue, the color of a winter sky at dusk, its corners soft with age. He placed it on the desk next to the bank's pristine disclosure form. The passbook made no sound. He spoke. His voice was low and even. "I think you'll find this account is exempt." The manager's smile tightened by a millimeter. "Sir, I understand, but as you can see from our current fee schedule, no personal savings accounts are exempt from the dormancy policy. It's an automated system. It applies to everyone." The manager picked up the passbook, a relic from another era. He opened it. The pages were yellowed paper, the entries written in neat cursive by tellers long since retired. The last entry was a deposit of $10 made 3 months ago. The manager's name was Henderson. He was 34 years old. He had been with the bank for 6 years. A rising star moved from a suburban branch to manage this small-town office. He saw a simple problem, an elderly customer confused by modern banking. He prepared his next sentence, the one about how banking has changed, how regulations require these things. Before he could speak, Arthur spoke again. "Check your bank's charter, the one from 1980, and then check Public Law 96-221, Section 303. Henderson stopped. He had never heard of it. He looked at the old man. There was no anger in his eyes, no confusion. There was only a quiet, unmovable certainty. The room went quiet. The hum of the air conditioner seemed to get louder. It was the sound of an institution breathing. The bank was a branch of a national chain, a massive entity with a name made of acronyms and a headquarters in a city of glass towers 1,000 miles away. But this building was old. It was made of brick and granite, with tall windows that looked out onto the town square. It had been the Farmers' Trust of Oak Haven for 70 years before the first merger in 1998. Then it became something else, and then something else again in 2007. The name on the sign changed, but the granite steps remained, worn into shallow bowls by generations of local feet. Henderson, the manager, was a product of the new bank. He understood quarterly reports and compliance software. He wore a suit that fit perfectly and a watch that told him the time in 3 different zones. He saw the world as a series of procedures. A problem, like the old man in front of him, required the correct procedure. First, the explanation. Second, the offer to waive a single fee as a courtesy. Third, the firm restatement of policy. He was on step 1. Arthur Vance was a product of the old bank, of the old town. He had worked as a mechanic for 45 years at the Ford dealership on the edge of town, the one that was now a dollar store. He understood engines, the patient logic of parts working together. He knew that a small noise, ignored long enough, could become a catastrophic failure. He was not a man who ignored small noises. He sat in the chair, a sturdy wooden thing that had probably been there since the 1970s, and he waited. He had done his homework. He had brought his tools. Beside his chair on the floor was a simple accordion file made of faded red pressboard tied shut with a loop of string. He had not opened it yet. Henderson saw a stubborn old man, a bit of local colour, a minor inconvenience in a busy Tuesday morning. He decided to move to step 2, but with a slight modification. He would re-explain first, more slowly this time. "Sir," he began, his voice taking on a tone of exaggerated patience, "I can appreciate that you've been a customer for a long time. We value that. However, the financial landscape is very different than it was in 1980. Federal regulations have changed many times since then. Our account products are standardized across the country to comply with current laws. An old local charter, even if it existed, would have been superseded by subsequent mergers and the adoption of our national banking standards." He gestured at the lobby, at the modern posters and the sleek ATM. "This is a different bank now." It was a solid argument, logical, final. It was the argument that had worked 100 times before. It assumed the past was irrelevant. It assumed the person listening hadn't checked. Arthur said nothing. He let the silence answer. He had learned from his wife Sarah that the person who is sure of their facts has no need to rush. The silence stretched. It became uncomfortable for Henderson. He was used to filling silence. Arthur was not. He could sit with it for hours. He was a man who knew how to wait for an engine to cool. To understand why Arthur Vance was sitting in that office, you have to go back 3 months, to a sunny Saturday in early May. It was his grandson Leo's 9th birthday. A card had arrived in the mail that morning. The envelope was addressed to Leo in handwriting Arthur knew as well as his own. It was his wife Sarah's hand. She had been gone for 5 years, but she had planned for this. Before she passed, she had written out a stack of birthday cards for each of her 3 grandchildren, one for every year until they turned 18. She had given them to her sister with a set of instructions and a book of stamps. Each year a card arrived. It was her way of staying present, a quiet echo of her love. Inside this year's card was a crisp $10 bill and a short note. "For your first dollar account, my love. Keep saving. Grandma Sarah." Leo, a boy with his grandmother's bright eyes, held up the $10. "What's the first dollar account?" he asked. Arthur smiled. "It's a special account your grandma started for you the day you were born." He went to the old secretary desk in the living room, the one that had been Sarah's. In the back of a drawer, inside a shoebox filled with old photographs and report cards, he found it. The small, blue passbook. He opened it. The first entry was from 9 years ago. A deposit of $2. The only entry. They drove into town that morning, to the big granite bank on the square. The teller, a young woman with brightly coloured nails, looked at the passbook with a confused frown. She had never seen one before. She had to call over a manager, Henderson. He had been polite, efficient. He found the account in the system, a ghost on the servers. He processed the $10 deposit with a few quick keystrokes and handed the passbook back. He had made a small joke about it being a museum piece. A month later, the first statement came in the mail. A thin white envelope. Balance, $12. Arthur put it on the fridge. Another month passed. Another envelope arrived. This one felt different. He opened it at the kitchen table. He saw the numbers. Previous balance, $12. Service fee, $35. Current balance, minus $23. He stared at the paper for a long time. It wasn't anger he felt. It was a deeper, quieter feeling. a sense of something wrong, a promise broken. That evening, he went up to the attic. It was hot and smelled of cedar and dust. He found the box he was looking for, a sturdy cardboard box labeled Sarah, Household. Inside were old appliance warranties, tax records from the 1990s, and a file folder simply marked Bank. He sat on an old trunk under the single bare light bulb and began to read. He found the original paperwork from 1984, a brochure with a cartoon squirrel on it advertising the first dollar youth savings account. He found a welcome letter from the bank president at the time, a man named Abernathy, and tucked in the back, he found a folded yellowed newspaper clipping from the Oak Haven Gazette, dated April 2nd, 1980. The headline read, "Congress passes new banking bill. Farmers Trust adopts youth savings charter." He began to read the article, his finger tracing the lines of faded type. The article mentioned a new federal law, the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act of 1980. The next day, he went to the public library. He learned how to use the microfiche reader, his large hands fumbling with the delicate controls. He spent 3 days scrolling through endless pages of federal statutes, and then he found it. Section 303. It was mostly about phasing out interest rate caps, but buried deep within the text was a provision, a carve-out designed to encourage savings, allowing federally insured banks to establish special accounts for minors or nonprofits that could be permanently exempted from certain fees. It was optional. A bank had to choose to adopt it in its official charter. The newspaper clipping said his bank had. The account wasn't just an account. It was a story, a promise. Arthur remembered the day they opened it, back in 1984, for their first grandchild, a girl named Emily. He and Sarah had sat not in a glass-walled office, but at a big oak desk across from the bank's president, old Mr. Abernathy. He was a man who wore tweed jackets and knew every customer by name. Sarah, a first-grade teacher for 30 years, had been the one to push for it. She had read about the new law and the Youth Savings Charter. She believed in the power of small things, small seeds, small savings, small promises. She told Mr. Abernathy, "It's not about the interest, it's about the lesson." She wanted a place where a child could put their birthday money and watch it sit there, safe. A place untouched by the complexities of the adult world. A place without fees that ate away at the principal. She said, a child's account shouldn't go backwards. It's a terrible lesson to teach them. Mr. Abernathy had nodded slowly. He understood. He was from that same world. He turned the passbook over in his hands. He said, "You're right, Sarah. It's a matter of principle." He took out a heavy rubber stamp from his drawer, the kind with a wooden handle. The stamp had the bank's seal and a space to write in. He wrote, "Fee exempt, per charter, October 1st, 1980, in the space with his fountain pen, then pressed it firmly onto the inside cover of the passbook. He said, "There, the charter protects this account, and as long as I'm here, my word protects it too." It was a promise made between two people who understood that a community was built on such things. A handshake deal backed by a rubber stamp and a line in a charter. Sarah had kept that passbook and the ones for the other grandchildren that followed in her desk. It was more than a record of money. It was a record of her faith in the future, in the idea that small, careful acts of stewardship mattered. Now, Sarah was gone. Mr. Abernathy was gone. The Farmers' Trust of Oak Haven was gone. But the passbook remained. The stamp remained. And for Arthur, the promise remained. This fight wasn't about $35. It was about standing in for Sarah. It was about honoring the world she believed in. A world where a promise was a promise, especially one made to a child. He could have just paid the $23 and closed the account. It would have been easier, simpler. But it would have been a betrayal of Sarah, of the lesson she wanted to teach her grandchildren, of the simple, sturdy principle that you don't let a crooked thing lie. You make it straight. He sat at his kitchen table night after night, the papers from the attic spread out before him, the quiet hum of the refrigerator his only companion. He made notes in a small spiral notebook. He pieced the story together from 1980 to the present day. He was not a lawyer, he was a mechanic. He looked for the broken part, the seized bearing, the faulty wire. And he had found it. It was a piece of institutional memory lost somewhere in the friction of two corporate mergers. Back in Henderson's office, the silence was a physical thing. Arthur finally broke it. He slid the blue passbook across the desk again, this time open to the inside cover. He tapped the stamped insignia with his forefinger. First dollar youth savings, he said, established 1984. He then pointed to the faded handwriting. Governed by Charter Amendment dated October 1st, 1980. Henderson stared at the stamp. It was meaningless to him, an artifact. He was about to speak when Arthur reached into his pocket again. He pulled out a single sheet of paper folded into a neat square. It was yellowed and brittle at the creases. A photocopy. He unfolded it and laid it on the desk. It was a copy of the Charter Amendment from the Farmers' Trust of Oakhaven. The language was plain, direct. Pursuant to the options granted under Public Law 96-221, all accounts opened under the First Dollar Youth Savings Program shall be exempt in perpetuity from all standard service, maintenance, and dormancy fees. Henderson read the words. Then he read them again. His professional calm began to fray at the edges, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had not expected this. He had expected an argument about fairness, a plea for sympathy. He had not expected a document. He fell back on his training. He found his script. This is an old document, sir, from a different bank. Our modern terms and conditions, which are mailed to all customers annually, supersede any and all prior agreements. This was his second line of defense, obsolescence. A new rule erases an old one. It was a clean, modern idea. Arthur did not respond. He just let the photocopy lie there on the desk, a silent witness. Its existence was a challenge to the manager's entire worldview. Henderson was starting to realize this was not a simple problem. The old man was not confused. He was prepared. The manager felt a growing sense of unease. He was trained to handle customer complaints. He was not trained to handle history. He looked at the accordion file on the floor next to Arthur's chair. It was still closed. What else was in there? The thought made the air in the room feel thin. Henderson stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, a small gesture of reasserting his authority. I need to make a phone call, he said. He walked to a corner of his office and spoke quietly into his phone, his back to Arthur. The words were muffled, but the tone was clear. It was the sound of a man reporting an unexpected problem up the chain of command. He used words like legacy charter and customer claims exemption and pre-merger agreement. Arthur waited patiently. He looked at the pictures on Henderson's desk. A smiling wife, 2 young children on a beach. A different world. A world of digital photographs and paperless statements. A world that had forgotten about passbooks and rubber stamps. Henderson hung up the phone. His face was set in a firm, neutral expression. He had his new talking points. Our legal team, he said, his voice now more formal, confirms that while this charter did exist at one time, it became null and void after the 1998 merger. The assets and liabilities of Farmers' Trust were acquired, but the charter was dissolved. All accounts were converted to our national standard products at that time. You would have received multiple mailings about this over the years. This was the third and final argument, the big one, the corporate law argument. A merger is a death and a rebirth. The old bank is gone. The new bank makes the new rules. It was insurmountable. It was the argument that made Fortune 500 companies. Arthur finally reached down for the red accordion file. The string came undone with a simple pull. He placed the file on his lap and opened it. It was not full of complex legal documents. It was mostly just old letters, bank statements, and brochures, all organized neatly by year. He pulled out a thin bundle of papers held together by a dry-rotted rubber band. He laid them on the desk. "Here are the notices from the 1998 merger," he said, "and the ones from 2007. I kept them." He tapped the top letter, the one from 1998. "It says here that existing accounts will be converted to the nearest equivalent product." He paused. "The nearest equivalent to a fee-exempt youth savings account is another fee-exempt youth savings account. Not a standard savings account. The bank failed to make an equivalent conversion. It made a profitable one instead." Henderson's face was pale. He had no response to that. But Arthur was not finished. He reached back into the file and pulled out one more document. It was different from the others. It was thicker, a set of photocopied pages stapled in the corner. "This," he said, "is from the 2007 merger agreement, Schedule 7B. I got it from the county recorder's office. It's a public document." He slid it across the desk. The page was titled Assumed Exemptions and Continuing Obligations. It was a list. A dry accounting of all the little promises and oddball agreements the new bank had to legally inherit from the old one. There were land easements, a trust for the town library, and, halfway down the page, a block of account numbers. From 7-34-5000 to 7-34-6500. Next to it were the words, First Dollar Youth Savings Program. Fee-exempt status to be maintained per original charter. The bank hadn't dissolved the obligation. It had legally assumed it. It had documented it. And then, somewhere in the vast humming machinery of its own systems, it had forgotten about it. The institutional memory was not just gone. It had been officially recorded and then actively ignored for more than a decade. Henderson stared at the document. There were no more arguments, no more procedures. The script was gone. The polished shield of policy was shattered. He was just a man in a suit, facing a truth that had been patiently waiting for him on a piece of paper in a county office 2 blocks away. Henderson was silent for a full minute. He sat back down in his chair, the authority drained from his posture. He looked at Arthur, then at the papers, then back at Arthur. He stood up again, this time without buttoning his jacket. "Excuse me," he said, and walked out of the office, leaving the door ajar. Arthur could hear him speaking to someone in the main lobby, his voice a low murmur. Arthur waited. He didn't touch the papers on the desk. He just sat. He had done his part. He had presented the facts. The rest was up to the bank. He had built his case as carefully as he would have rebuilt a transmission, piece by piece, in the correct order. 10 minutes passed. 15. Finally, Henderson returned. He was not alone. With him was an older woman, perhaps in her late 60s. She wore a simple grey dress and a navy blue cardigan. Her hair was white and cut short. She had the calm, steady eyes of someone who had seen everything. Henderson made the introduction. "This is Miss Albright." "She's our regional compliance officer. She was just in town for a branch audit." Miss Albright did not offer her hand. She nodded curtly at Arthur. Then her eyes went to the document spread across the desk. She walked around the desk and stood beside Henderson, looking down at the evidence. She did not speak. She simply read. She picked up the passbook, turning it over in her hands with a familiarity the younger manager lacked. She examined the stamp. She read the photocopy of the charter amendment. Then she picked up Schedule 7B from the merger agreement. She traced the line of account numbers with her finger. Henderson began to speak, to explain, but she held up a hand to silence him. After a long moment, she placed the document back on the desk and looked directly at Arthur. Her expression was unreadable. It was not an apology. It was not an admission. It was a simple acknowledgement of a fact. She turned to Henderson. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of finality. "He's right, John. The exemption is valid. These accounts were supposed to be flagged in the system conversion. Obviously, they weren't." A pause. The room was utterly still. Miss Albright then looked at Henderson's computer monitor. Her voice was sharp, clinical. "Pull up the product code for the Old Farmers Trust youth accounts." Henderson, fumbling slightly at the keyboard, typed in a series of commands. A screen appeared. Miss Albright leaned closer. "Now show me how many of those account numbers are still active on the main server." Henderson typed again. A progress bar appeared. It spun for a few seconds. Then a number materialized on the screen. 1,482. 1,482 accounts. All of them, for years, had been systematically and incorrectly charged. The problem was no longer about $35. The small noise Arthur Vance had heard had just become a catastrophic failure. 2 days later, Arthur was back in the same office. Henderson was not there. Albright was not there. In their place was a new man. He wore a dark, expensive suit and shoes that shone like black mirrors. He introduced himself as Davies from the bank's corporate legal department in Charlotte. He had the easy, confident air of a man who flew first class and solved problems for a living. He did not try to re-argue the case. His approach was different, smooth, conciliatory. "Mr. Vance," he began, his smile warm and professional, "I want to start by apologizing. There has been a significant clerical error, an oversight stretching back many years. We are deeply sorry for the mistake. We are, of course, prepared to refund all fees charged to your grandson's account, with interest calculated at a generous rate." He slid a folder across the desk. "And for the trouble we've caused you, for your diligence in bringing this to our attention, we would like to offer you a settlement of $5,000. The only thing we require is your signature on a standard non-disclosure agreement." Arthur listened. He did not look at the folder. The $5,000 was a distraction. The non-disclosure agreement was the point. They wanted to buy his silence. They wanted to make the problem go away quietly. Arthur looked at the man. He was not interested in the money. He was interested in the principle. "What about the other accounts?" he asked. "The 1,481 others?" Davies's smile didn't falter. "We will be conducting a thorough internal review to identify and resolve any other affected accounts. That is a separate internal matter." Arthur shook his head slowly. "No," he said, "it is the same matter." He leaned forward slightly. "You will refund every dollar from every one of those accounts, with interest, compounded annually, based on the prime rate for the year each fee was charged. And you will publish a notice of the error and an apology in the Oakhaven Gazette." The lawyer's smile finally vanished. He tried to reason with him, the cost, the logistical complexity of contacting account holders from decades ago. He explained that a private settlement was cleaner, faster for everyone. He hinted that the bank's offer of $5,000 could be increased significantly. He was trying to find Arthur's price. He did not understand that Arthur was not selling anything. "I'm not here for my trouble," Arthur said. "I'm here for the promise your bank made." He reached into his accordion file one last time. He took out a small, cheap spiral notebook, the kind a student might use. He opened it on the desk. The pages were filled with his neat, blocky handwriting, columns of numbers, dates, interest rate calculations he had looked up at the library. The bank's lawyers, in their initial panicked assessment, had estimated the total liability at around $800,000. Arthur had done his own math. He had been more thorough. He tapped the final number at the bottom of the last page. $2.4 million. That, he said, is what you owe. The lawyer stared at the number, then at the old mechanic's steady, quiet gaze. For the first time, the man from Charlotte looked uncertain. He had come to solve a small problem. He was now facing a very large one. There was no lawsuit. There was no public fight. The bank's legal department did their own calculations. They came to the same number, or a number close enough that they didn't want to argue about it in front of a judge. A story about a multi-billion-dollar bank stealing money from children's savings accounts for 2 decades, a story uncovered by one quiet grandfather, was not a story they wanted told. A week later, a registered letter arrived at Arthur's house. He signed for it and opened it at the kitchen table where his work had begun. It was from the bank's general counsel. It was a letter of unconditional surrender. The bank agreed to all of his terms. A full refund for all 1,482 accounts, with interest calculated as he had specified. A fund would be established for the unclaimed money, and a public notice would be placed in the paper. Arthur read the letter twice. He then folded it neatly and placed it in the shoebox with Sarah's other papers. He took out Leo's blue passbook. He opened it to the last entry. Using a black fountain pen, the one he used only for signing important papers, he made a new entry on the next line. He wrote the date. In the description column, he wrote fee refund. In the credit column, he wrote $35. He calculated the new balance, $47. He closed the book. He did not feel triumphant. He felt a quiet sense of order restored, a crooked thing made straight. He looked out the kitchen window at the yard. A large oak tree in the center, the one he and Sarah had planted as a sapling on the day they moved in 50 years ago, stood tall and strong against the afternoon sun. Its branches provided shade for the entire house. Some things you plant for the next man. Some things you plant for the child they'll become. The promise was kept. The work was done. 3 weeks later, Arthur was in his small workshop behind the house, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and oil. He was sanding a small block of pine, his hands moving in a slow, steady rhythm. The wood was becoming smooth, warm to the touch. The door creaked open and Leo came in, holding the folded local paper. "Grandpa," he said, "look." He pointed to a small boxed notice on page 4 near the classifieds. It was from the bank. It was titled, "Public Notice to Holders of First Dollar Youth Savings Accounts." It spoke of a systematic billing error and provided a phone number for people to call to claim their refunds. "Is this about my account?" Leo asked. Arthur nodded. He didn't stop sanding. "It is," he said. "Your grandma started that account. It was important to her that the bank kept its word." He ran his hand over the now silky wood. It was the roof for a birdhouse he was building. A simple thing. He had done what he had to do, and now he was back to his own work, the quiet work of building and fixing. Some men collect problems. He collected patience. The bank thought the issue was a $35 fee. They were wrong. They thought the problem was one old man. They were wrong about that too. But sometimes the problem isn't a bank. Sometimes it's a state highway department that's been paving over a family's property line an inch at a time for 50 years. And the person who notices isn't a grandfather with a passbook. It's a high school history teacher with a box of her great-uncle's survey maps from 1928. We'll see what holds.